The Frankfurt School was a school of thought with its roots in the 1920s, founded in the Weimar Republic, but its most developed critiques of modern society emerged after World War II and are basically a synthesis of Freud and Marx, a psychoanalytical neo-communism. One of the Frankfurt School's greatest thinkers, Theodor Adorno, wrote that the point of social theory is to, quote, demonstrate the disjointedness, the untruth of totality, end quote. Totality is any general truth statement here. And, quote, totality is to be opposed by convicting it of non-identity with itself, end quote, which is to say, by bringing out its contradictions. He goes on, in Negative Dialectics, quote, the totality of identical definitions would correspond to the wish fulfillment picture of traditional philosophy, to the a priori structure, and to its archaistic late form ontology, yet before any specific content, this structure is spiritualized coercion and, quote, in other words, because that's somewhat over-involved, definitions imply some view of reality, and this view, whatever it might be, is taken to be secretly coercive. All traditional philosophy is a cover for social oppression. That's what he's saying there. Adorno's aesthetic theory basically holds that art ends up presenting such visions of reality and so perpetuating oppression. Therefore, as he famously wrote, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, because poetry, positive art, transmits an idea of truth and victimizes that which is considered to be outside that idea. Poetry leads to genocide. What this means is that anything that presents itself as a whole, as healthy, as harmonious, as beautiful, as true, is threatening, is oppressing, whatever falls outside it. If this is beautiful, something else is ugly. If this is true, something else is a lie. To avoid oppression, anything that seems beautiful, therefore, has to be engaged negatively, has to be exploded in terms of its own contradiction. Now, Adorno's rejection of positive definitions, traditional philosophy, accounts of reality, and so on, produces a kind of mental habit of always lashing out against what he calls spiritualized coercion, against, that is, any image or idea that seems whole, harmonious, beautiful, coherent, wholesome. This habit leads to the contemporary suspicion we see today that any beautiful art, any story with a moral is, quote, fascist. The modern critic is jaded. His heart is flaccid. He hates power and beauty and strength and confidence. He has to intrude on any morality with skepticism. This kind of mental filter prevents us from seeing a beautiful thing as independent of our problem-solving mental chatter, our suspicion that it must be hiding something, some horrible oppression. So-called woke activism is like this. It has to make beautiful things ugly, accusing them of being oppressive, embedding them in some invented, terrible context of violence that they supposedly perpetuate, imputing on them the guilt of lulling the masses into conformity with injustice. You get a virtue-signaling death spiral of Puritan histrionics. The political left has unfortunately mutated away from caring about the livelihood of workers towards a struggle for all sorts of supposedly oppressed collectives. This is by now cliché to say, but it goes further. Supposed political radicalism of the sort promoted by mainstream discourse, media, large corporations, and so on, imagines itself as championing the oppressed, but more than this, it is hostile to traditional institutions, morality, canons of beauty. The motivation here is a belief that older identities and institutions are inherently oppressive, so that things can only be celebrated if they are a weapon against those older identities. Yes to the girl boss, but as a weapon against the patriarchy. Yes to alternative sexuality, but as a weapon against the stodgy conservative. always as a sort of hostile gesture. The clearest justification for this hatred of the wholesome might be found in the work of certain Frankfurt School intellectuals. Now, I don't mean that their ideas were directly taken on board by modern so-called woke activists, only that they provide a thorough understanding of the psychology and rationale of what we see today, more thorough even than what you might read in Derrida or Foucault, say. Now, Adorno would not have been kind to the modern wokesters. He was more radical than them. He rejected linear storytelling in cinema, or even tonality in music. He liked atonal, sort of discordant music. He was also not into sexual liberation, how it came about in the 60s, but the core of his philosophy defines a lot of the psychology that the political establishment promotes in the West today, because it's useful to break down old structures and replace them with new systems of control. And that's my claim. Radical Freudian and Marxist critique has actually served the power elite, not resisted it. Another Frankfurt School thinker that shared Adorno's core philosophy but took it in a more mainstream direction is Herbert Marcuse. We particularly see his influence today in the sex-obsessed nature of a lot of modern culture. In fact, crucially, the ultimate rejection of distinct forms and traditional philosophy that Adorno promotes has to end up in the rejection of gender and sexual difference, because that's the most fundamental distinction into which tradition splits the human person. Man, woman, appropriate erotic attraction, inappropriate erotic attraction. That's really the centerpiece of traditional systems. And Marcuse saw this. In Eros and Civilization, he lays out his vision for erotic energy and political revolution. His view is roughly that sexuality has been repressed because economic systems, labor relations, are oppressive. People have to be forced to work so that someone, the feudal lord, the capitalist, industrialist, etc., can extract surplus value from their labor. They cannot therefore be allowed to play freely, which would take the form of pursuing sexuality for pleasure's sake. This repression means that heterosexual reproductive marital relations have been the standard. But if capitalism is abolished and communism takes hold, there will be no need for repressing sexuality any longer. Such repression is not a necessary part of all civilization, as Freud thought. Marcuse argues that you can have socially useful work that keeps up civilization, a communist civilization, where such work is just play and erotic play. He believes all play is ultimately erotic energy, because he is fundamentally a Freudian, even if he disagrees with Freud on some things. The end of repression comes through radical individualism. That's where he maybe disagrees with mainstream Marxism, because for Marcuse, the myth of Narcissus, the Greek myth of the man who falls in love with his own reflection in the water, hisses his reflection and ends up drowning, provides the hero, ultra hero, his type of future non-repressive civilization. So does Orpheus, but we leave that aside. So why does Marcuse claim that narcissism, erotic narcissism, self-love, can be politically liberating? Well, because it begins from an individual who refuses to, as he puts it, perform for society by conforming to reproductive heterosexuality. This individual refuses Freud's reality principle, so-called, which is to say social norms, and from that refusal, a whole new kind of culture can be created. Marcuse writes, quote, "Reactivation of polymorphous and narcissistic sexuality ceases to be a threat and can itself lead to culture building." He's talking about his alternative culture, communist culture. If the organism exists not as an instrument of alienated labor, as in capitalism, but as a subject of self-realization. In other words, if socially useful work is at the same time the transparent satisfaction of an individual need. End quote. This is all very Freudian. The idea is that the initial experience of life is narcissistic, in that the world is not perceived as separate from the infant and is erotic. quote, at this primary stage of the relation between the pre-ego, the infant, and reality, the narcissistic and the maternal eros seem to be one, and the primary experience of reality is that of a libidinous union, end quote. So Marcuse is wanting to recover that sense of unity between the infant and the mother, Narcissus and his own reflection in the world. He doesn't see himself as different from the world in adults, which is pretty repulsive. But again, he's building on the incorrect premises that he gets from Freud. Such a polymorphous, narcissistic eros, erotic orientation, in a civilization where no repression is required by productive needs and labor relations, a communist civilization, will make the whole body of the individual erotic, not just certain specific parts of the body that are considered sexual features. And indeed, the whole society will likewise become erotic, he argues, in Eros and Civilization. Under repression, there had been a, quote, socially necessary desexualization of the body. The libido becomes concentrated in one part of the body, leaving most of the rest free for use as the instrument of labor, end quote. So if you don't find the shin of a person to be a sexually enticing feature, it's probably because you're living under feudal division of labor or modern capitalist division of labor. This is the odd idea. But, quote, originally, the sex instinct has no extraneous temporal and spatial limitations on its subject and object. Sexuality is by nature polymorphous, perverse. The societal organization of the sex instinct taboos, makes into a taboo, as perversions practically all its manifestations which do not serve or prepare for the procreative function, end quote. So Marcuse is defending perversion, so-called, and arguing that it was only made into a taboo because of these kinds of oppressive social institutions that really wanted to focus everything in on procreation. One of his most utopian passages reads as follows, quote, the erotic aim of sustaining the entire body as the subject or object of pleasure calls for the continual refinement of the organism, the intensification of its receptivity, the growth of its sensuousness. The aim generates its own project of realization, the abolition of toil, the amelioration of the environment, etc., the creation of luxury. All these activities flow directly from the pleasure principle. There is sublimation and consequently culture. This sublimation proceeds in a system of expanding and enduring libidinal relations, which are in themselves work relations. The idea of an erotic tendency towards work is not foreign to psychoanalysis. Freud himself remarked that work provides an opportunity for a very considerable discharge of libidinal impulses. So then, the new culture will run on, quote, libidinal relations, which are in themselves work relations. In other words, the workplace, which is now a place of play but socially useful, is also erotic. And he quotes from Freud's group psychology and the analysis of the ego, quote, experience has shown that in cases of collaboration, libidinal ties are regularly formed between the fellow workers, which prolong and solidify the relations between them to a point beyond what is merely profitable, end quote. So future communism will make every social relation erotic because play will replace work, and play is fundamentally erotic because Freud said so, and reproductive heterosexual union will give way to narcissistic union, also between employees at the workforce. In modern slang, we would say this is a hopelessly PORN brained gooner fantasy dressed up in intellectual verbiage. But yeah, in this non-repressive civilization, humans will feel themselves at one with their environment, even as the infant feels at one with its mother. And so environmentalism in particular, the idea of melting into your environment and taking care of your environment, Narcissus as in love with his reflection, and therefore with the water in which he is reflected, becomes key to the whole vision of Marcusean communism. Marcuse gets into this in his key essay on environmental activism called Ecology and the Critique of Modern Society. And it's important because also nowadays we see that environmentalism, systemic environmentalism, not genuine environmentalism, has become kind of the centerpiece in many ways of dominant discourse, of the dominant ideology. For Marcuse, environmentalism can be, quote, political and psychological movement of liberation, end quote. But how can environmentalism represent psychological liberation? Well, because Marcuse begins his discussion of environmentalism in terms of Freud's dichotomy between the death and life drives, thanatos and eros, and views environmentalism as the victory of eros. Quote, the primary drive toward destructiveness resides in individuals themselves, as does the other drive, eros. The balance between these two drives also is found within individuals. The balance between their will and wish to live and their will and wish to destroy life. Both drives, according to Freud, are constantly fused within the individual, and if one drive is increased, this comes at the expense of the other. In other words, any increase in destructive energy in the organism leads mechanically and necessarily to a weakening of eros, to a weakening of the life instinct. This is an extremely important notion, end quote. But Marcuse departs from Freud. He starts off with Freud's category of the death drive, the desire to destroy life in order to return to the womb, that is, to a state before the diversity and the confusion and the pain of life, a state of total peace. But Marcuse wonders whether we might pursue this same desire for peace, for the end of pain, not as death, not as destruction, but through the life drive, Freud's eros, as erotic energy. Marcusean environmentalism is about the, quote, pacification of external nature, which in turn will pacify, quote, nature within men and women. Environmentalism should shift the balance within individuals towards life, towards the erotic, over death. We could view this idea that peace, life without pain, can be pursued not by escaping life and the world, but by maturing and pacifying life as a positive idea. However, by taking Freud's framing of the death instinct as a desire to escape pain as his own starting point, what you get in Marcuse is the making of painlessness into the priority of politics, not the integrity of different entities, proper order, the flourishing of each thing as itself, justice between things, not strong persons who do not want to hurt one another, but weak persons who cannot hurt one another. In other words, weak persons because they don't distinguish between self and world any longer. They are not distinct entities in that sense. They have melted into a perverted universal eroticism. Sure, the search for erotic union and pleasure moves one away from pain in physical terms, but it also implies an inappropriate merging of everything with everything else. In fact, Marcuse dislikes distinct forms, as comes through in his opposition to traditional European representational art. It's very much a feature of modern, supposedly radical politics that every struggle gets joined to the push for non-traditional forms of sexuality, prominently today transgenderism, for example, because the underlying logic is that you have to break down distinct forms, and erotic energy is the best way to do that. So we can sort of pause here and look at the argument as Marcuse lays it out. The underlying logic, which agrees with Adorno's own fundamental core premise, is that when a thing is beautiful, it implies that whatever is outside of it is ugly. If something is attractive, something else is unattractive. If something is normal, something else is abnormal, etc. And any standard, therefore, implicitly justifies hierarchy and oppression. The beautiful over the ugly, and the oppression of conforming the ugly to the standards of the beautiful, etc. It's therefore moral to reject beauty, to be ever critical of beauty, to deconstruct it. This rejection is actually the Freudian death drive, an inherent desire to escape pain, belief behind life, including all of its injustices, its hierarchies, its oppressiveness, but also its harmony, its order, its beauty, and to return to the blissful sleep of the womb, of unity with the mother. But, says Marcuse, the more fruitful and politically powerful way to pursue this drive of escaping from the pain of life is through erotic energy, melting the distinctions between things, erasing hierarchy and oppression, and all categories by merging together. And this is pursued and manifested principally as the merging of the individual with his environment. So environmentalism becomes the sort of centerpiece of erotic communism that Marcuse has in mind. So if we switch gears here and look at some recent contemporary environmental activism, which may reflect some of this, we find that there was something symbolic about the vandalizing of famous art pieces by the Just Stop Oil environmentalist group a year or two ago. Because what did the destruction of art, especially representational, culturally significant art, European art, have to do with saving the planet? True, people travel to see these pieces and burn fossil fuels to do it, but folks travel for all sorts of reasons. Well, this was very consistent with Marcuse. Here's what he had to say when discussing his opposition to, quote, the representational art of Europe. This art represented the world as a world of things to be dominated and owned by men and thereby falsified the world. Now, Marcuse's identification here of representational and traditional and specifically European art, for some reason, with oppression tells us that he shares Adorno's premise that any positive statement, any coherent form, implies repression. Beautiful art, a linear story with a moral, even musical harmony for Adorno, whatever it is, it puts forward an ideal and so offends and oppresses whatever doesn't fall in line with that ideal. Representational art, the distinct nature of things in themselves, implies domination because Marcuse's concept of liberation is a version of Freud's death drive. We have to escape from life, but as the search for erotic release in Marcuse's case. It's the perverted desire to destroy distinction and merge together. Now, revolutionary art, in contrast, quote, must be shaped in such a manner that it reveals the negative system in its totality and at the same time the absolute necessity of liberation, which is an overly complicated way of saying that art should be negative, critical, opposed to traditional canons of beauty. In a word, ugly. Marcuse continues, quote, the work of art must, at its breaking point, expose the ultimate nakedness of man and nature's existence, stripped of all the paraphernalia of monopolistic mass culture, completely and utterly alone in the abyss of destruction, despair, and freedom. The most revolutionary work of art will be, at the same time, the most esoteric, the most anti-collectivist one. For the goal of the revolution is the free individual, end quote. So pure individualistic nihilism is how you get utopia. Erotic communism comes by way of the narcissist who rejects traditional heteronormative union. Marcuse's Marxism ends up in perfect individualism, an individualism so complete that the individual is alone, undefined by any inherited identity, any loyalty to this or that group. In fact, such an individual would be completely naked and vulnerable to top-down control, which is my greater point that all of this leads us to tyranny. But anyway, the end point of the libertarian is the end point of the communist in Marcuse. As is often the case with these sorts of attempts at liberation, they lead to increased control on the part of government and corporate structures. While it was attacking art, Just Stop Oil, a group of activists, was calling for governments to invest more in renewable technologies. So if representational and traditional art is part of the problem somehow, technology is the solution. Technocracy replaces culture and identity, just as the individual's ultimate right to determine everything, even his own gender identity, requires a strong medical establishment, a state to guarantee hormone treatments, surgery, hate speech laws to give you and protect your new identity out in the world, So you get the total individual, the total individualism of this kind of mentality, leading to the total collective, the total collectivism, dependence on external systems. Again, far from resisting coercion, the rejection of healthy community and identity, of natural authority, including that of the family, which Marcuse is attacking because he's attacking traditional reproductive eros, precisely leads to pathological, tyrannical authority. You don't get free. You actually fall under a far more oppressive form of authority. Okay, I hope that was interesting. There was a lot there, but thank you for listening and subscribe if you would like to. Until next time.